Well, hi, thank you very much indeed for the presentations. I found them fascinating and interesting, and there's a great deal of information there to try and absorb. So questions, we very much welcome questions coming in on the interface. I wanted to be selfish because I've got a microphone and actually ask one question that's both a technical question and also a governance question. So it's a kind of part one to Doug, part two to Ina. Doug, you mentioned briefly this idea that if we decided to use stratospheric aerosol injection for a period of time, and then for some reason it was terminated, it stopped, there would be a rapid increase in temperature. The termination effect, some people have called this. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and the extent to which it would be a serious problem? And then perhaps, Ian, you could tell us a little bit about what that might mean in terms of governance and the geopolitics of that kind of environment where we suddenly have a rapidly warming world because of an action, an intentional action that's taken.
Okay, so talk about the technical aspect of that. How severe that is going to depend on how much cooling you're relying on. So if you are relying on stratospheric aerosol injection to cool the planet by, say, 1 degree or 2 degrees Celsius, and you then instantly stopped doing it, then the aerosols persist in the stratosphere for about a year or so. The climate response isn't instantaneous when you remove those aerosols, but over the next 4 or 5 years, you're going to get all of that 1 or 2 degrees of warming back. So you'll be roughly back where you started. There's some second order effects in that. Just a caveat to all of that to keep in context, of course, is if you were, if hypothetically somebody started to deploy this soon, it's certainly going to be decades before that is ramped up to substantial cooling. But then you can sort of imagine a scenario in which that really, really rapid temperature shock might be worse than if you had never started geoengineering in the first place. So that's an important thing to keep in mind in governance is ultimately you have to protect against the possibility of it simply being turned off. And there is at least one paper where people have sort of talked about some of the things that you could put in place to reduce the probability of that.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good bridge for me to start talking about what that paper contains. I think there have been arguments that termination shock is not a real threat in the sense because once you've started stratospheric aerosol injection, you basically have this Damocles sword hanging above you that termination shock is a possibility. So no one on the planet has an interest in stopping stratospheric aerosol injection. So if for some reason one actor were to stop it, you could expect that another actor would jump in and sort of continue the process in order to avoid the situation of termination shock. The problem is more a question of, when would it be feasible or reasonable that such stopping of the injection would really take place. So, I mean, there are many things that are unexpected in the future. It could be that, for example, something like war breaks out. It could be that there's a global economic recession. It could be that we are facing very different threats or risks that could contribute to the fact that nobody on the planet can continue the injection of stratospheric aerosols, or that nobody takes on the responsibility or feels a responsibility to do it. So those are the kinds of questions, that unexpected circumstances that could take place, of course. And also there is this moral question of, can we allow one actor to start injecting stratospheric aerosols and then expect from the rest of the world to have to continue that process because that one actor started it. So there's a bit of a question of, who's going to take responsibility for continuing this over such a long period of time? Because if one person or one actor starts it, then there's this expectation that they will also have to continue. And then is the question, does that actor then actually want to take on that responsibility in the first place? So it's a lot about expectations between countries, I would say.
It's a complicated game of chess as well.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of pieces moving around here, and there's a great deal of uncertainty about not only what may happen, but how the pieces are allowed to even move around this chessboard. Anyway, thank you very much for that.
There's relatively few areas in which we're making decisions that have such long-term consequences, right? It's not unique, but it is relatively
yeah, absolutely. I could think CDR and how we ensure permanence of storage may be something broadly similar, but it's a long-term problem with plenty of time to resolve, which you may not have with the termination of stratospheric aerosols, of course. Anyway, thank you. I'm going to turn to questions coming from the audience. Just frame the question slightly. Linnea talked about how things are defined drives how they're governed. And currently, at the moment, the debate is broadly being defined by research and the research community rather than the broader community. So that will start creating issues around the way in which governance downstream, if this were to ever be taken forward, might evolve, one's feeding into the other. So we have a question, what are the boundaries between research and the deployment of stratospheric aerosol injection? Where does this boundary, where the boundary set impact on the governance needs and considerations? How do we flow from one to the other?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that's one of the thorny issues when it comes to outdoor research, because there's been a big discussion about what is small scale research and what is large scale research. And large scale research, would that already be considered deployment? This is something that Doug has talked about in his presentation. So drawing the boundaries there is a really thorny issue, let's say, and I think there are no clear responses to that yet. The fact is, sort of the regulations that we do have in place are about reducing pollution that one country, sort of the pollution that one country produces and how it affects pollution in other countries. That is part of international regulation. Whether scientific experiments would fall under the same kind of regulation, I think really depends on the scale that we're talking about and whether that would be considered a form of pollution or not. So I think when we're talking about small scale experiments, like, I don't know, like the experiments that are being proposed at Harvard, I'm not sure that would fall under the international conventions that we have right now, because it's not a state actor doing it, and it's a much smaller kind of example of trying out, seeing how aerosols interact with their environment. So that I think maybe if countries had a problem with that, and that would be more of a sort of a long-term strategic or moral concerns that are linked to, experimenting with anything to do with stratospheric aerosol injection in the first place. But any plane or any mode of transport that goes through the air probably produces a lot more pollution than what these individual experiments would do, and those are not regulated in the same way. So it's a difficult issue, definitely. And I think the only way to go forward here is probably to communicate, to increase communication between the states that do have a concern on this, and to discuss, how to go forward with it, because there's not one person who can define, what's relevant for international law and what's not relevant for international law.
If I can, I want to just add a little bit on the technical dimensions of the research. Any experiment is intended to resolve uncertainties and understand how things work. And broadly speaking, there's uncertainties in our climate model projections that come from sort of very specific processes like, aerosol coagulation or chemistry or things like that occur essentially at small scales. And then there's uncertainty in how the climate system is going to respond to those. And for the former category, any experiment to resolve those is likely to be extremely small from a global perspective. And the latter category, basically, there's no such thing as an experiment at all, because in order to generate a signal that is large enough to detect how the climate is responding, I think pretty much every single person on the planet would call that a trial deployment at least. for some things like marine cloud brightening, the technical line is likely to be pretty fuzzy. But for stratospheric aerosols, because their lifetime in the stratosphere is large, like order a year, and because they circulate broadly, you're sort of in this realm where either your experiment is very small or it's not an experiment.
Okay. So there's a lot of weight then, in effect, put on the research governance mechanism. Yet that's very, very diffuse. It's a patchwork, a polycentricity of different types and approaches. Different countries have different research governance frameworks and mechanisms. Learning societies have different approaches, and so on. So it's a bit of a, to use a euphemism, a bit of a pickle. Do you think research governance currently is actually, as it's constituted, capable of providing the framing to allow this process to take place?
Maybe Doug, you're more familiar with the experimental situation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the challenges is that if your concern is purely environmental impacts of a particular test, then arguably there are already environmental impact assessment rules in any developed country. And so other than like jurisdiction shopping to do an experiment, there's something there. But I think a lot of the concern that is placed on experiments in particular is the concern that it's sort of a slippery slope, right? And I think even some of the people who've talked about proposed experiments have sort of almost emphasized that and said, oh, you know, it's time to get out of the lab and start making this real. And those types of concerns aren't the type of concern that existing research governance is really intended to deal with. It's like, how do you have a conversation about, is this the direction that we even want research to be going in? And what are the consequences of that research endeavor? Are not, you know, in some ways that doesn't necessarily make sense to staple that requirement to an individual experiment.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about nation states and countries, and we've talked about research and the research community. I have a question that's about a different set of people. So if a non-state actor were to deploy some form of aerosols in the stratosphere or other SRM interventions, indeed, for example, over the Pacific Ocean, the question asks, what restrictions would they face as non-state independent free agents?
I think we can learn a little bit from examples in the past here. What happens when a non-state actor sort of announces or tries to implement this sort of technology at a comparatively large, or let's say a significant scale. There have been examples where a non-state actor has tried or announced the use of ocean iron fertilization in order to to increase salmon production, but also to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere with the intention of garnering carbon credits with that relatively larger experiment than what scientists were doing at that time. And that caused quite a flurry in the international legal setting. So it started off a whole process of regulation under the Convention for Biological Diversity and the London Protocol to prohibit any sort of use of marine geoengineering technologies that were not of scientific nature. So I think if a non-state actor were to start deploying stratospheric aerosol injection in a similar kind of way, I think we would see a very similar process happening, that all of a sudden there is something real out there that governance can actually respond to rather than a scientific idea or a content of scientific papers. And that would start a whole process of initiating governance mechanisms to stop this kind of deployment. In addition, I think what the CBD has in terms of decisions on not using geoengineering technologies that are not based on scientific justification or that are not for scientific purposes could also apply for this particular situation. It's not a binding decision, but it applies to states. It's normatively important. It's important for diplomacy. So whatever state is basically responsible for that particular non-state actor, I mean, every non-state actor belongs in a sense to a certain state. That state would have to do something about that rogue actor. So I think that's what would happen.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's hard to imagine if you're actually trying to produce an effect that's large enough to actually influence the climate. You're actually talking about an operation that requires, a number of aircraft and an airbase and some supply chain to get sulfate to that. And I think that requires at least the implicit support of some state.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think perhaps it may be that the question was thinking about people like Amazon, for example, who are going to commit billions of dollars to addressing climate change, and they may be able to operate at the scale of a state even. But anyway, let's move on. Having talked about these different groups and framings, we have a question that's actually asking, well, okay, we've got ideas, there's uncertainties, but we're having a conversation about those things. But the question in some ways asks, is this actually even possible? So if we already have people burning palm oil trees causing darkening of the skies, this is illegal, it shouldn't be allowed to happen, and yet it goes on. So if this governance process were to evolve, do you think it would actually be functional, that it could actually deliver?
I'm
gonna let you answer that one.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think functionality of governance systems is always a big issue, and I think that's what we're also seeing with the climate change regime in general, that we do have so-called functioning governance systems in place, and we have a whole very complicated system in place to monitor how governments are or whether how they're working on their mitigation targets, how they're working on their adaptation targets, how they're working on their finance targets, and still it doesn't work particularly well. I think, however, that there is a bit of a difference between intentional actions such as using stratospheric aerosol injection, especially if it's so politically controversial, vis-a-vis sort of systems that have already been going on for a long time, and economies that are already sort of running. It's where the economy is running and everybody is contributing to producing greenhouse gas emissions. There's a little bit of more lenience towards, oh, well, like we're all doing the same thing. It's difficult to stop all of this. It'll take a long time. And so there's less, immediate reaction to things like burning down the Amazon rainforest or burning down, in general, producing greenhouse gas emissions and thereby contributing to climate change. However, a direct intervention that can be placed on a single actor, where responsibility can essentially be assigned to one actor, I think that's a slightly different question. So even though, even if the governance mechanisms that are in place might not always be exactly effective, I think that the reaction of other states in terms of stopping that actor from doing it, or at least having some sort of response in terms of economic sanctions or whatsoever, depending on what kind of incentives or also positions those other states have, I think that will play a larger role than if a single state does go ahead and deploy stratospheric aerosol injection.
Doug doesn't look terribly keen to answer this one. Other than to point out that this isn't like a one-time thing, right? You have to continually maintain it. So you don't want to get there, but there is, of course, always the last resort of military. If you don't want something to happen, there are ways to make sure that it doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So I think the governance. The struggle at SAI is really, it's more of a collaborative governance effort, because it's something that we want to, or if someone wants to do it, then it's the question of garnering enough support in order to do it, because I think just doing it will cause reaction from other states.
Okay. So this sounds like a complex, detailed, drawn out process that's unrushed. So we have a question that kind of rubs up against that, and that's the desire to reduce global temperatures as soon as possible, to reduce temperatures as soon as possible. And there's currently no real governance in place or any restrictions in place for testing or deployment. How long should we give the politicians to decide on governance before it can be regarded as just too late?
Oh. So let me just rephrase the question so that I understand correctly. The question is that we don't have a lot of time left in order to, well, I don't know, get our act together. And so how long should we give governments, how much time should we give governments to make a decision on whether we should progress with stratospheric aerosol injection research, or at least thinking about deployment? Is that correct?
Yeah. And by implication then, can it become too late?
I don't think anything in climate change is ever too late, in the sense that, yes, it would have been better if we cut our emissions 20 years ago, but we didn't. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't bother to cut our emissions today. And I think the same sorts of statements can be applied to this as well. So I'm not sure that the too late framing is the right framing, but I certainly agree that there could be climate events like, when the Arctic sea ice disappears completely, that could precipitate some push for action. And that push for action may occur prior to having what I might consider adequate scientific knowledge and what pretty much anybody might consider adequate governance capacity.
Okay.
But, arguably that was true beginning of this year in terms of a response to a pandemic too, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean we stopped. Doesn't mean we didn't do anything. It just means that our response was not as good as it should have been.
Which is probably always going to be the case, or has always been the case with the climate change question as well. We should have always, we should have acted so much earlier. But the question is then, in that situation of crisis, is emergency and crisis being used as a framing to advocate for stratospheric aerosol injection, which is often the case? And is that the right kind of framing that we want? Does that kind of framing leave us with no choice, essentially, because we are arguably in a climate emergency, we are facing a crisis, but does that framing then allow us, or is that enough to argue for stratospheric aerosol injection? I think that's a very difficult political question that some people will answer with yes and some people will answer with no, but it fundamentally boils down to what we value, what's important. So is it just about, if we think about just keeping the temperatures below 2 degrees, which is a very good indicator for the kinds of climate effects that are coming, then that might lead to arguing for stratospheric aerosol injection. But one could also think, what about the side effects of stratospheric aerosol injection? What about the long term, the fact that we have to then subscribe to a technology which we don't know how long we will have to implement, and the possibility that this will lead to much worse consequences than if we had not implemented it in the first place. So it's not easy to say, there has to be a certain deadline by when we need to decide on whether we should go forward with this or not, because it has so many dire consequences. It's a path that we can't really go back from unless we sort of try it out for a little while and then decide, actually, no, we're not going to do this. Then maybe temperatures haven't changed so much. But if we commit to that, then that has a very long commitment. And it potentially, I think the mitigation deterrence effect of like, oh, well, now we have something in place that saves us from the worst consequences of climate change, and we don't feel that pressure of decarbonizing. That is also something to take into account, and that affects the decision.
No.
Let me just add briefly to that. From my perspective, which is obviously a personal opinion, but I would say this sort of underscores the urgency of both getting moving on the research so that decisions actually are based a little bit more in sound knowledge, and also the importance of things like C2G's effort and webinars like this one to build the capacity for ultimately being able to make those decisions, so that we're not, we can at least reduce the odds that we're facing some crisis where we have to make decisions without either of those, without either the governance or the science.
Oh, okay, that's an important point, I think. We have another question for, this is directly to Ina, actually. In the last part of your presentation, you spoke of recognizing existing institutions and mentioned that there are some concerns that are already addressed or could be with small changes. Can you say a little bit more about that, what the small changes might be?
Yeah, so as I was mentioning in that one of the first slides, there's a bunch of conventions that already address certain issues. So the way that maybe it's something that's helpful in terms of thinking about political decision making and governance is to think about where, what kind of institutions exist, what kind of mandate do they have, and how can stratospheric aerosol injection fit into that mandate. So rather than designing a whole new governance instrument for a particular type of technology, which really hardly exists except for nuclear, maybe for nuclear proliferation. We can think about what kind of mandates are out there in terms of existing environmental regulation, and how can those mandates apply to stratospheric aerosol injection. So for example, some of the things that I was talking about is this effect on the ozone layer. So if it turns out that stratospheric aerosol injection would have an effect on the ozone layer, then that is the type of particle or the type of whatever is sort of chosen to do the injections can easily be regulated under the Ozone Convention. And the same goes for the long-range transboundary air, the Convention on long-range transboundary air pollution, which does effectively regulate the emission of sulfur particles. So if scientists, go on discussing how and what kinds of technologies they use, or what could potentially be used to do stratospheric aerosol injection, it needs to be taken into account that some of these ideas are already regulated or discouraged under certain international conventions. That's what I mean. Like, think about what are the mandates that are out there, and then see how issues that are linked to stratospheric aerosol injection can be discussed under those, or how to say, taken into account into those conventions.
Doug, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we move? No, okay, that's fine. That's fine. Doug, I think it's more of a question for you. What's the role of various types of modeling and models, and what do they play? What role are they playing in developing the understanding of the potential of SAI deployment? What are the limits and the strengths of those models? And linked to that, in what way are the models themselves governed? Because they're informing an enormous amount of the debate, telling us there may be changes in precipitation. Who's governing those models?
Actually, that's a complex set of questions there. But so first of all, models are the only tool that we will use to project the future. And so, or project what would occur with certain types of decisions. So in that sense, they are the tool which we use to say, here's what we think would happen if you were to go deploy this, right? There is no, we have some analogs like volcanic eruptions that can inform us, but fundamentally those are observations are informing the models that we then use to say what would happen if you were to deliberately deploy stratospheric aerosols. To be clear, these are the same models that we're using for projecting climate change. And so in that sense, whatever governance there is of that, which is really, the short answer is there isn't any explicit governance. There's implicit in the sense that when IPCC writes a report projecting future climate change, they take all of the climate models that have contributed to CMIP, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, and there will be scientific papers that say, okay, this model is really good at forecasting this, and this model is pretty much useless, and that information gets taken into account. But it's not, you know, nobody's sort of like saying what you can and can't model. There was another piece to your question, and now I've forgotten it.
I think you've got it actually. I think you've got it. We're getting very close to the end of our time together today. So I've just got with trying to find my clock, just 3 or 4 minutes left. I just wondered, are there any other last minute thoughts you would like to share with us that haven't been covered during this session as part of the ongoing conversation? We don't need answers, but why you think issues that haven't been addressed are important would be interesting to hear.
I think just on the topic of models that you had already brought up earlier, I think the governance, what goes into those models and what kind of decisions are made within those models and how they inform the scientific or the later on policymaking field, that is quite an important topic that needs to be, you know, unpacked a little bit more. I think that is unpacked in different literatures, of course, and in different fora. But I think the role that these models play for defining things like what is the global temperature target, what's risky and what's desirable, that's not to be underestimated. So I think scientists have a pretty big role, especially modelers have a pretty big role, even though I know that they're doing neutral scientific research, but just understanding what goes into the models and the decisions that are made to inform those models, that should be, I think, in my opinion, a little bit opened up also to input from wider society. Yeah.
And to be clear, I mean, there is some governance in the form of, like, scientific journals require transparency of funding and, you know, require that your simulation output be accessible to anybody. So that is in fact a form of governance. If I were to say one thing, is that this can sound a bit like science fiction and something we don't have to engage with today. I actually, and I always went to go to meetings and said, oh, you know, this is going to be, you know, 15, 20 years off in the future. It's not clear to me that that's actually true. If you want to deploy something in the tropics, you would need to develop fundamentally new aircraft that don't exist today. But if you wanted to deploy something in the Arctic, for example, the tropopause is lower, and so there are existing aircraft that could go do this in the Arctic. And in principle, if some major country decided they wanted to cool the Arctic next year, maybe next year is a bit too aggressive a timeline, but this is not necessarily that far off. So I really think we need to be serious about making sure we understand both the governance and the science.
Well, thank you very much. And our time now is coming to an end. So it remains me just to thank Ina and Doug for coming along and sharing their thoughts with us, and for their presentations, and also for Ghosh for his presentation. This conversation continues, it's ongoing. We've just heard we haven't got as long as we might want, so we better get on with it and enrich that conversation as much as possible. So do check back into C2G's website and see the other activities that have been going on under the C2GLearn and C2G Discuss rubrics on the website. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a good day, as much as is left for people in the East, and as much you've got to look forward to in the West. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks.
Paul.